Welcome everyone to the Interdisciplinary Research Hub for today's presentation by Iffat Mirza. Before I go on to introduce our speaker for the day, I just have a few quick announcements to make. Tomorrow, the 26th of June, is the concluding session of the seminar series Al-Mizan, Justice and Harmony in the Works of Ibn Arabi and the Akhbari Tradition. It is going to be a panel discussion involving all the previous seminar speakers. Then on the 3rd of July, we have a seminar by Dr. Atif Khalil from the University of Lethbridge as part of the Hidden Treasures seminar series. And the subject of the seminar will be the spirit, the heart, and the intellect, a Sufi perspective. Dr. Khalil's seminar is free of cost, but one needs to register. You can find the required details for that on the MES website. Finally, I just want to remind us that the IRH YouTube channel is updated. All the previous talks have been uploaded, and today's will be uploaded shortly as well. So please check that out too. With that, now for our awaited moment, Iffat is going to talk about mysticism, creativity, and the written word, Arab references in a selection of works by Jorge Luis Borges. Iffat is currently doing her MPhil in European and Latin American comparative literatures and cultures at the University of Cambridge. She's interested in looking at the influence of Andalusian philosophers, mystics, and literary giants like Ibn Arabi and Ibn Rushd on Latin American writers, particularly Borges. Iffat's broader project is to explore the influence of Islamic philosophy and literature produced in Andalusia on 20th century Latin American writing. So with that, and without further ado, here is Iffat and Mysticism, Creativity, and the Written Word.
Hi. Thank you for that introduction and for everyone joining in. I'm really flattered that you think that this is interesting enough to listen to. Can I share my screen? Is that okay?
Yeah, let me make you co-host so that you're able to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it should be fine now.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Just because I like visual representation, and I think it'd be nice for you to not have to just listen to me. Sorry, so this project essentially sought to look at the extent of Arab and Islamic and Sufi thought and culture on the works of the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges, who lived from 1899 to 1986. And this is something that has already been discussed by some academics, notably Luce Lopez Baralt. However, I felt that so far the field of study on this topic was limited to a handful of stories, namely El Aleph, El Zahir, and La Busca de Averroes. So the Aleph, the Zahir, and the search for Averroes. But I wanted to explore this or extend the study further to the rest of his works, which are less obviously Islamic or Arab in theme, as a means to further explore just how fundamental Arab, Islamic, and Sufi thought is to Borges' corpus of works. Because if anyone's read any Borges, it's quite obvious that it's virtually impossible to do so with at least 10 volumes of encyclopedias next to you. Because he just seems to know about everything, and then is able to incorporate it sometimes just so subtly but potently into his work. Thematically, I ended up looking towards Borges' engagement with the idea of the cosmos and the question of infinity, and how these align with some more Islamic views and already established representations of the cosmos and infinity in Arab culture. So just to kind of begin with, his surviving widow and the sole owner to the rights of his works, Maria Kodama, she stated in an interview, it is natural that Borges felt attracted towards the Sufis because Sufism not only produced men who are great mystics, but also great poets. So kind of from that alone, I think we can kind of see how important it is to think about mysticism, and particularly Islamic mysticism, in his approach towards literature and a lot of the themes that he explores. Then, as I did kind of mention Lopez Baralt, she has also touched on this and asks and answers the question, how much did Borges really know about Arabic literature? And she says that it's more than he openly admitted, and certainly much more than his critics have so far presumed. Borges read deeply in Islamic literature, theology, mysticism, so deeply that we are still in the process of understanding the real implications of his artistic experiment. His passion for this forbidding Eastern world was such that he even ventured to learn the rudiments of the Arabic language. But even had Borges been innocent of Arabic, he must have had at least some notion of its grammar and vocabulary, especially the complexities of that language's triliteral root system. Throughout his life, he would quote the old quote, which says that every word in Arabic means itself, its opposite, and a kind of camel. So I think that kind of just as a basis, almost as a justification or vindication of why I'm exploring this, just shows that this is very, very important. And even though at least as far as my research went, I'm not able to find anything where Borges directly quotes or references Ibn Arabi. I think Ibn Arabi, being al-Shaykh al-Akbar, the great master, it's impossible that some of his ideas did not influence him if he is well versed in Sufism and Sufi thought. But actually, we kind of begin to see Borges's turn towards Islamic ideas, almost not necessarily pertaining just from, but largely from the fact that he was very suspicious of national literatures. So in his lecture, El Escritor Argentino y la Tradición, that is the Argentine writer and tradition, he leaves in no doubt about his distinctly cosmopolitan angle on what is national literature. He says that I understand that there is a fundamental difference between the gaucho's poetry and gauchesco poetry. There is a difference between someone who is writing about someone versus someone who is someone. And to illustrate this point further, he actually turns towards Gibbon's analysis of the Holy Quran, whose apparent indifference to the iconic and ubiquitous camels of the East would constitute, in contrast to the wild proliferation of gaucho, in a certain nationalist Argentine literature. And that actually for him stands as a sign of the Quran's authenticity as an expression of the Arab world. And the indifference of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, towards his quotidian everyday experience of just seeing camels about, for him proves that the Quran is truly the Arab work. And I think that turn towards looking at the Holy Quran as a literary work is why he has such a global reach. His works kind of, they extend from Chinese philosophy to Norse mythology, European Enlightenment to Islamic Sufism, which is kind of what I'm looking at today. And for Borges, literature as a national product was a limiting and counterproductive venture. Borges was suspicious of excessively lengthy works which claimed to encompass complete histories of nations. This is something that we see in his story El Aleph, which unfortunately I can't go through today because of time constraints. But in that, the main character, also named Borges, is caught in this literary rivalry with a man called Carlos Argentino Daneri, who is writing what Borges calls a terrible poem. And it's this really, really long poem, which is meant to be a totalizing history of Argentina. And he hates that. And because it's not authentic, because it's not actually saying anything of real substance. And the reason it's not saying anything of real substance is because it's too long. And then that question of brevity leads me to wonder about Borges's own actual style, the real Borges, not just the character, although that's an interesting way of thinking about who is the real Borges, and that's something that he also questions. So he doesn't write very long pieces, short stories, or poems, sometimes literally just paragraphs, something that you might think would just be scribblings at the back of a book or something, but nonetheless they are deeply infused with philosophical and scientific ideas that can lead one pondering for days or months, or at least writing dissertations about them. So I was wondering about why he is attracted to the shorter form, and I'm very convinced by the fact that it's his attraction towards 1001 Nights. He preferred it to be translated as 1001 Nights rather than the Arabian Nights, which it often is translated as. So Las Mil y Una Noches, that one night kind of extends, that's what infinity is for him. He, in his lecture on this work, he talks about how it's not 999 nights, it's not just 1,000 nights, that 1,001 nights, that and one is constantly reminding you that things don't end. And therefore it is the infinite book. And I think that his affinity towards the short story or narration as a genre to explore concepts of destiny and man's place in the cosmos derives from Nights due to the fact that he sees it as the infinite book. And short prose form also becomes a space where the infiniteness of each word is further necessary. Essentially, literature and language become a space where destiny and the anxiety of death can be mitigated, because that desire to hold the infinite can be realized. And because existence, considering as something that is infinite or that is the cosmos, when it's foregrounded in the short story, it is not necessarily that it can be contained, but it can be understood. And actually, I will kind of mention how I believe Borges uses similar ideas to those of Ibn Arabi to mitigate these anxieties of death and destiny. But his references to nights, 1,001 nights, they are ceaseless. And ultimately, it is the model for Borges' understanding of time and history as realms of infinity and contingency, and for his reflection on narrative form as necessary for exploring vast concepts, as it is form that balances brevity and duration, and the singular and the universal, which are very, very key preoccupations which consistently arise throughout all of his works. We see explicit references in The Garden of Walking Paths, The Book of Sand, Tlan Ukbar Urbis Tertius, but also thematically in tales such as The Two Kings and The Two Labyrinths, which I will go through in due course. And actually, interestingly, and I think almost hilariously, Borges tried to pass off as one of Burton's translations of Nights, and Burton's translations were his favorite translations. So kind of having established the importance of the Quran and 1,001 Nights, which is central to kind of our understanding of Arab literature, the next, or rather the first question that I kind of posed for myself in my exploration was, what is a poet? Borges being a poet and him constantly writing about poets. So from just a very lexical perspective, there is a vast difference between the Western understanding and the Arab understanding of poet. So from the word poet comes from the Greek, and it alludes to the idea of creation and making, whereas the Arab shair comes from the triconsonantal root shair and alludes to seeing, sensing, and knowing. So we can already see that there is a difference in who is a poet and what the poet's role is. Sorry. And from this, I think we can learn a lot about what the role of God is. So throughout the Quran, the term kun faya yakunu is consistently used, be and it is. It's repeated 8 times. And the term al-Khaliq, the attribute, the creator, is used in 12 verses, at least in my counting. I hope I haven't miscounted any. But the insistence of God as the creator of the universe is central to Islamic theology, and the power of God is manifested through his control over his creation. And it is essentially what bears witness to his existence. Islam, even from its very the words of initiation, I bear witness that Muhammad, that there is one God, that there is no worthy of worship except Allah, and it's all about bearing witness. And the existence of the universe bears witness to the existence of God. The importance of the written word is also prevalent throughout the Holy Quran. God's authority as the creator of the universe and of man is identical to his authority as the writer of the Quran. The universe and the cosmos is an extension of his written word, for all bears witness to his omnipotence. And then coming back to Borges, one of Borges' collections is called El Hacedor, published in 1960, which translates to the maker. Although very interestingly, he actually says, he goes from the English to the Spanish. So he says El Hacedor is a translation for the maker rather than the other way around. The short prose piece of the same name, El Hacedor, very interestingly concerns itself with the father of Western literature, that is Homer. And it imagines the moment in which he lost his sight. Borges admits that the story can be thought of as autobiographical, drawing a parallel between Homer's blindness and his own. And in his lecture about blindness, he underscores just how important Homer's blindness is to our understanding of who he was. In fact, to the point where we're not sure if Homer existed, but we are sure that Homer was blind. So throughout this, Borges shows the poet not just as a maker, but also as a seer. The fact that he cannot see the material physical world, but his turn towards poetry after losing his sight is what makes him a poet. Borges acknowledges that Homer is constructed to be blind and underscores this blindness as integral to his status as a poet. He could not be a poet without being blind. In his inability to perceive the material world, he is able to perceive a higher truth. But despite this, Homer's loss is discussed as an unfortunate event. Borges underscores the personal anguish that comes from the loss of sight, almost hyperbolic even. The lamentation is not just of blindness, but now it is particularly on the inability to perceive beauty, that of the whole universe, which is ironic to me because, well, even with someone who has 20/20 vision, how much of the universe's beauty can they even perceive? Little, if anything. So the insistence of losing sight of something that is already imperceptible is ironic, and particularly so its suggestion that the universe subsequently becomes more visible to the blind bard. So thus we see Borges use the great Western poet to move towards a more Arab perspective of poetry, and actually in this even a more Islamic idea. If we're thinking about Al-Khaliq as the creator, we must also think of Al-Basir, the all-seeing. So God is not just the creator, he is the all-seeing. God as the creator of the universe, it is also through seeing and through witnessing that this comes into existence. And then moving towards now this kind of Arab understanding of what the poet is, I then thought that this would be an interesting tale to read in conjunction to a poem that Borges wrote called The Unending Rose, which is about Attar of Nishapur, the 12th century Sufi poet. And in this poem, Borges has constructed him to be a blind poet, though he was not blind historically. And he is holding a rose and he ponders upon the beauty of the rose, although he cannot see it. And the rose, of course, is a common Sufi symbol for the infinite and ineffable nature of God. Borges allows the blind poet, both Homer and Attar, to shut their eyes to the material world in order to direct their sights towards the universe. But the fact that Attar of Nishapur was not historically blind shows Borges' insistence on blindness as a positive quality for a poet to possess, or if not positive, at least integral. And I think we even see this in contemporary literature, kind of coming from the Arab or loosely used Eastern world. If you think about Orhan Pamuk's My Name is Red, when, I don't know if anyone's read it, but when that miniature artist takes a needle to the eye, peeling off layers so that he may be blind and be able to prove his standing as a miniature artist, or his legitimacy to be able to call himself an artist in the Sultan's court. I think that question of blindness is just very, very integral. And it's almost as if the poet, Homer and Attar, and in the case of Pamuk, the artist, he wishes he were blind so that he may be able to see God more clearly. And then from blindness, I think we come to the question of memory. So we've got the quotes from The Unending Rose and El Asidor. He dug deep into his memory, which struck him as bottomless. This is, of course, Homer, and managed to snatch from the whirlpool the lost recollection that shone like a coin bathed by rain. Perhaps he had never looked at it. The irony of never having looked at his memory when he could see, when his ocular vision functioned. Equally, in The Unending Rose, Attar narrates, I am blind and I know nothing, but I see there are more ways to go and everything is an infinity of things. And this is because they now retreat into their memory. I think it was Chitik who says that Ibn Arabi's discussion of anamnesis is the most platonic of ideas that come about in Ibn Arabi's thought. And this is evident in both of these texts. In both of these, we see Homer and Attar turn towards their memories. Homer's memory, according to Borges, becomes interminable and relocates the infinity of the universe from that which is external to the creator or poet to the realm of infinite internal perception. And that Plato's anamnesis is critical here. All knowledge is intrinsic to being, but is forgotten and must be recovered. In the tale of El Asidor, Borges narrates Homer's recovery of knowledge and memory only after he loses his sight. And it's when his father, it's a memory of his father telling him to make a display of his masculinity after he's essentially basically been bullied by some other boys. Similarly, Borges' Attar says, I am blind and I know nothing. But it is only in his blindness that he sees there are more ways to go, and then he begins to rely on his memory to be able to describe what the rose must be like. He cannot talk about the rose, and as we know, as the Sufi concept of metaphor for God, he cannot know what God is until he has lost his sight. So then coming on to, as he says, everything is an infinity of things. The next kind of preoccupation for me was the infinity of words and meanings. The Quran reads, and we explain the signs for people who have knowledge, chapter 9, verse 11, in my copy at least, which situates divine knowledge as something always already present in everything that surrounds man, and yet is still in need of deciphering if man is to comprehend God. Knowledge can be infinite because knowledge or recognition is intrinsic to the signs of the universe. And of course, we're thinking about knowledge from the Arabic term ilm, which does mean knowledge, but also has many other connotations, particularly that of recognition. And thus we're stuck in this kind of middle realm of what is to know, but also what is to recognize. And of course, Ibn Arabi reminds us that signs must be read in order to mean anything. And there is this element of reciprocity between God and man's reading of his signs. Borges interacts with this idea, I would say, most pertinently in the stories La Biblioteca de Babel, the Library of Babel, and La Escritura del Dios, the writing of the God. This is something, or this selection is primarily in the fact that in each of these we see this anxiety of existence and death that comes from a fear of being unable to read and comprehend the signs of the cosmos, and therefore being unable to comprehend the self, like what man is inside this cosmos. And in the two stories, we see the universe to be incoherent and intimidating, and therefore man to be incoherent and intimidating to himself. Yet both present a strong yearning for understanding. So before I kind of just do a quick rundown of the stories, essentially what formed the basis of my interpretation of these was Ibn Arabi's thought of the fact that there are two ways in which God has inscribed his being. The first is within man, but really the perfect man, i.e. the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And the second, that is within the cosmos. Ibn Arabi suggests that like man, the cosmos is also built in the form of God. The former is considered a microcosm and the latter a macrocosm. The question of the 99 divine attributes of God is central, which we've already seen come up in Borges's, at least my reading of Borges's work. In both, God manifests his divine attributes differently. Chittick summarizes Ibn Arabi's thought well, saying that God created the cosmos upon his own form, primarily in respect to the multiplicity of his names, but he created man primarily in respect to the unity of the names. The Sufi tradition is a large part concerned with creating that stable bridge between that microcosm and macrocosm and allowing man to exist in a greater harmony with the cosmos. So just to give a quick introduction of the Library of Babel and the writing of the God. In the Library of Babel, we have this infinite library in which every single text that can ever be written exists, because there is a finite number of letters and therefore a finite number of combinations of these letters. But even within that, it's almost as if it would be infinite. So for example, if you've got two completely identical books, but one letter is like on a different page or like repeated or something, and therefore you've just got this infinite number of, I say infinite, but technically there must be a finite number. And you've just got people essentially driving themselves insane by trying to find a perfect book, or the book which talks about their own vindications. That's what Borges talks about, men going in there to find their vindication and falling into despair, committing suicide. And we've got these two sects of librarians, ones that believe in the idea that a messianic figure would come who has this esoteric knowledge of how to read these texts. And then this other almost fascist kind of group who think we just need to start burning the books so that we can begin to narrow them down. But of course, that's another infinite task to take upon, because there's just far too many books. The library's design, as Borges talks about, they are hexagonal figure rooms, and he really goes into it. And it's reminiscent of the geometric patterns of Islamic art. The repetition of such shapes, according to art historians, offers the possibility of infinite growth. Throughout a seemingly ordered configuration of the library, the infiniteness that this order allows is precisely what leads to its confusion. Thus, we see the library or the universe as the macrocosm, to use Ibn Arabi's vocabulary, and each text within it, i.e. each man, each person, as the microcosm. Readers who venture into the library, who are in search of their own vindications, eventually come to despair. And amongst the chaos and disorder, they cannot find those vindications. And despite knowing that they exist in the library, they cannot find it. And such anxiety comes, I think, from the fact that they see themselves as separate entities from the library, yet they know that there's a part of themselves that the library possesses and that they cannot reach. And that inability to align the microcosm to the macrocosm, or rather even the inability to see the two entities as something that can be aligned, is anxiety-inducing. And I think Ian Arman's reading of Ibn Arabi's hermeneutic is applicable here, which he interestingly actually derives from Borges's commentary on medieval thinkers of the infinitely readable texts. He says that he kind of recalls the idea that the all-encompassing infinity of the divine mind anticipates every Quranic nuance, every so-called chance or coincidence, and every hermeneutic variation as one more unspeakable development in the infinite will. Again, so that idea that knowing that these vindications exist, but and they are prior, they've existed prior to these people existing, but they are unreachable. So the similarities between the library and the cosmos within the Sufi framework should also be extended to the Quran, which is, according to Ibn Arabi, a further expression of the cosmos. It has infinite meanings, all of which are intended by God. Writing in the Futuhat, he states, we say concerning the senses of a verse that they are all intended by God. No one forces anything upon God. That is, though the interpretation may be read by man, this interpretation already existed as a creation of God. Again, just like the vindications. So Arman says that the Quran is a book about which we can know nothing, an infinitely well-kept secret that turns all of our attempts at interpretation into a series of hopeless guesses. Similarly, the Library of Babel, all searches turn into a series of hopeless guesses. To quickly just go through La Escritura del Dios, here it's a very different setting, and one that is seemingly not Islamic at all. It is about, it explores Mayan culture and the perceptions of God there. It is about the protagonist Sina Khan, who is imprisoned by the conquistador, and he is locked in a cell adjacent to that of a pacing jaguar. And in the patterns and the spots of the jaguar, he sees the writing of the god. But it's only through days and days and nights even of just searching for it and trying to comprehend it. His desire to read God as such is, after all, not so different from the Quranic teaching that the universe and the Quran are a sign for the believers, i.e. any kind of creation of God, the spots of a jaguar are a sign for the believers. And he asks the question, what sort of sentence, I asked myself, would be constructed by an absolute mind? I reflected that even in the language of human, there is no proposition that does not imply the entire universe, because everything is linked by this chain of thoughts. So if I was to think of a leaf, then I think of a tree, then I think of growth, then I think of nourishment, then I think of water, then I think of the water cycle, then I think of the sun, then I think of celestial bodies, then I think of the universe, then I think of God. Everything is linked to this idea of infinity. I can't think of anything without coming back to that question of infinity. And Borges' consistent drawing of the cosmos as something to be read allows the universe to actually now become ordered. So almost kind of what they were trying to do in the Library of Babel, but were unable to. Sina Khan, the prisoner, the Mayan priest and magician, is able to do that. In fact, he even knows that if he is able to find this formula, the writing of the god, and if he utters it, he will be freed from this dungeon. And he finds that it is a formula of 14 common words of 40 syllables. Similarly, the order and structure of the Library of Babel also help us to provide a basic structure, which Borges appreciates that a lot of the interpretations of these medieval texts were done through a numerical perspective, and as often was Ibn Arabi's own method, according to Armand. So ultimately, we are told that amongst the cacophony of nonsense that is the library or the pattern of the jaguar skin, there is some sort of sense that can be made if one were to read it as a total macrocosmic object rather than as something that simply contains microcosms. And through that, we can build that bridge. The expectation that language should be able to encompass the universe due to the way it's implying is infiniteness is integral to the way we read La Biblioteca and the Quran. Whilst each word may be indecipherable by man, it equally always holds the potential of being deciphered. And particularly in Ibn Arabi's view of the Quran, each interpretation of the Quran is predicted. Sina Khan searches for such signs in La Escritura del Dios and does attempt to read the cosmos, concluding that a mountain could be could be the word of God or a river or the empire or the arrangement of the stars. Again, everything bears witness to the existence of God. And therefore the chain of language cannot be broken because everything implies each other or another thing, and therefore the entire universe is encompassed in the implied meaning of any and all words. So just the final two pieces, I'm sorry, I don't know how much time I have left. The final two texts that I kind of looked at, or was able to look at for today's presentation, was Los Dos Reyes and Y los Dos Labyrinthos, so the two kings and the two labyrinths, and Ajedrez, which is a poem, chess. And this is where we considered the question of the duel. The duel is a very important motif for Borges, one that he keeps coming to in a wide range of settings, so often through the gauchos within kind of Argentina. But actually in these two texts, he does look towards the Eastern world or the Arab world. And I think actually the question of, well, why does he look towards the Arab world in these two is something that needs to further be explored. Los Dos Labyrinthos, or Los Dos Reyes y los Dos Labyrinthos, the two kings and two labyrinths, that is a very, very short story, I mean, literally 2 paragraphs, of the king of Babylonia who invites the king of Arabia to his palace, but in an effort to humiliate him, he has constructed a very, very complex labyrinth around the palace, through which the king of Arabs must find his way. And although exhausted and beaten and bruised, he eventually does, and through prayer he gets to the king of Babylonia, who, in front of whom he does accept the humiliation and he accepts the initial defeat. But he says, but you must come to my land and I will show you an even greater labyrinth. And most probably because his pride has been hurt, he then returns to his land and then launches a very brutal conquest on Babylonia. And the king of Babylonia must then come back to the king of the Arabs' land. And in this vast expanse of a desert, the king of Arabs' labyrinth, this desert, he dies of exhaustion and hunger and thirst. So that in this, the two kings are locked in this duel where the king of Babylonia assumes a godly pharaonic role, whilst the king of the Arabs sees his efforts as futile. And recognizing the legitimacy of authorship becomes a central issue in this now, in conjunction to an emphasis on the hubris of the Western perceptions of authorship and creation, I think. I think this is kind of why Borges now turns towards the Eastern world. Similarly, in the poem Ajedrez or Chess, Borges draws the duel between two chess players who, both exhausted, retire from the chessboard, but the game continues. Questions of free will and predestination are foregrounded, as Borges tells us it is only God who is moving the pieces, but ultimately ends the poem asking, but what God beyond God begins the round of dust and time and sleep and agonies? So to return to the question, why does Borges turn to Islam to consider these issues, and particularly the concept of the immortal God? The God of Christianity and Judaism are equally immortal, yet it is in the Arab lands that the immortality of God is heightened. Perhaps the Christian God for Borges is too human. Given his poetical work Cristo en la Cruz, Christ on the Cross, he explores Christ as a mortal and resigned man, as he is often depicted in Christian art and tradition. Already established, Borges associates infiniteness with Arab culture, as he deems it present in 1001 Nights. In fact, the resonances between Los Dos Reyes and the Nights are so stark, as I've already mentioned. And Borges even tries to pass the story off as one of Shahrazad's tales. I think another thing is also the fact that the Muslim God, another attribute of whose is Al-Hayy, the living, and Al-Malik, the eternal, he's making a stronger claim to his immortality. The story concludes on the question of immortality, like the two kings. La gloria sea con el que no muere, glory be with he who does not die. The fact that Shahrazad in 1001 Nights is also using storytelling as a way to avoid the inevitable death adds another death that is being avoided. If Borges did wish for Los Dos Reyes to pass as a story within Nights, it is his suggestion that the created is always destined to die, whereas the creator emerges supreme. And thinking of Shahrazad as a creator or a storyteller, she is the only wife of the Sultan who survives. Though the king of the Arabs is a creation of Allah in the dichotomy of his labyrinth versus the Babylonian king's labyrinth, it is the man-made labyrinth which proves to be weaker, and the desert possesses that glory of he who does not die. Thus, in the battle for glory, which rests in immortality, and the Arabian king is victorious. Also, in Arabian Nights, the extra, or 1001 Nights, the extra diegetic narrator ends the narration on praise be to God, whom the passage of time does not wear away. So I think that the hubris of the Babylonian king is juxtaposed with the question again of knowledge and recognition of the Arab king who submits to the power of God, standing of God, and thus present through the Arab king as they are in Nights. The Sufi tradition claims both that God cannot be understood by man, but equally, according to Sharia, a believer must recognize God. So we cannot know, but we can only recognize. Ibn Arabi writes, knowledge of Allah is too difficult for the faculty of perception of the intellect and the self, except for the fact that he exists and is holy. The king of Arabia, understanding God, is not his to understand, does not fall into these false pretensions, and allows God's own creation to serve as a labyrinth, though to the ignorant eye it is simply a vast expanse of desert. According to Ibn Arabi, man's language, a man-made labyrinth, cannot encapsulate God, and in his inability to recognize that, man's creation is pitiful in comparison to God's. So just finally moving on to the poem Ajedrez, chess. The game of chess is a common metaphor for destiny throughout art across the world and across time. But it was created in India and was popularized in Europe by the Muslims around the 15th century. And Borges reminds us that in the East, this war was declared, en el Oriente se encendió esta guerra. So it is fitting that he explores Eastern interpretations of the metaphorical implications of chess. Omar Khayyam's own Rubaiyat employs this metaphor, stating, "'Tis all a checkerboard of nights and days, where destiny with men for pieces plays." And Omar Khayyam is also quoted in this poem. Man's opponent being destiny in the language of a duel shows that they are both enslaved to one another in a dialectical reading, because both provide the other with the justification of their own and each other's existence. Rather than considering it solely a commentary on the concept of free will, the poem also lends it to be read as an expression of anxiety of the fact that the microcosm cannot be reconciled with the macrocosm. And I think that this kind of ambiguity largely is justified by Omar Khayyam's own ambiguous personality and historically. Some kind of contemporaries calling him a materialist and heretic atheist, whilst other Sufis understand the fact that no, you just need a very deep and esoteric meaning in order to understand him. So that kind of controversy of his figure allows us to at least flirt with some Sufi interpretations of such an aligning and see the players as a part of the chess game, not as puppets, but as integral to sustaining the purpose of the chessboard. After all, I would ask, what is a chessboard without any pieces? Furthermore, destiny is also a major theme in 1001 Nights, in many of Shahrazad's tales, and it is embedded in Islamic doctrine not necessarily as a confining restriction, but as an opportunity to grow closer to God, and particularly in the question of Laylatul Qadr, the night of destiny, the night of power, or as Borges translates it, the night of nights. It is considered the holiest night of the Islamic calendar, which sees Muslims spend all night in prayer, and the Quran promises the night of destiny is better than 1,000 months. So that piety that one can achieve in 1,000 months condensed into one night shows the elasticity of time in Islamic doctrine, which is particularly interesting in terms of destiny, where one considers it to be bound by time. The Night of Destiny features in Tlon Ukbar Orbis Tertius, where Borges refers to as the Night of Nights, the story of two academics stumbling upon the fictional land Ukbar in Asia Minor and the legend of Tlon, where nouns and things do not exist. Discovering in an elusive encyclopedia, we see another subtle nod towards nights, which, as the encyclopedia consists of 1001 pages. For Borges, again, this number is just always signifying the infinite. Just a final note, this poem, I would find it very difficult to argue that it's not an allegory, but I think that's really interesting and almost funny, because Borges openly declares the allegory like man's greatest aesthetic error. And so even for someone who declares the allegory as an error, it is something that he does feel the need to resort to, and he adopts the method that many religious scriptures, including the Quran, employ. And I think that the attraction towards the allegory as often a religious form of, or a sacred form of narration, though it's unattractive to him, represents a spiritual longing in Borges and a renunciation of the material world that is consonant with his mystical tradition. Ultimately, discussions of the infinite and of God cannot escape the allegory, as it is one way that one can understand what is incomprehensible. So thanks for listening to me. I guess what I've tried to show in this project is that Borges' allusions and references to Arab, Islamic and Sufi culture are far more deeply rooted than have currently been studied, and I hope that I've been able to make some sort of convincing argument that no, they are there, and one must look to the texts which even aren't so explicitly Islamic in nature. And actually, often when he's alluding to other cultures, it's important to still think of this as almost as a melting pot, because he isn't one to categorize by nation or language or culture. So in order to understand his works, we need to understand all of the nuances, not just the Western ones. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Iffat. That was a really illuminating discussion, a talk, and one that touched so many different disciplines. It was really, really very interesting. I sort of knew him as being interested in Averroes, but I mean, this was really new to me that he has taken in so much of Islamic and Arabic philosophy, literature, mysticism, so on. So thank you very much for that. Sorry that I came between the applause. So I think we could start the discussion and the question and answers, I think. So if anybody has questions.
Great.
I think everyone is just, trying to digest. We've been listening to. Juan has got the questions, and Juan, please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. My kids are roaming around, so I might hear that. I'm just curious if Borges ever mentions. He seems he was a very good linguist. Like the relationship sometimes between Arabic or Arabic words that are in the Spanish language, or if that is something that he looked at.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm entirely honest, unfortunately, other than being able to read the Quran, just from my own background, I actually don't know Arabic, so that was kind of a limitation to my study. But kind of as Lopez Ferralt argues that he does have some sort of understanding of Arabic as a language, and does kind of keep quoting the fact that Arabic is every word means itself something else and a type of camel. Definitely shows that he did try to learn Arabic at one point, and I think if we can understand that, we can see a bit more about his the way he approaches language. In Plan Ukbar and Orbis Tertius, that question of nouns not existing in this land is something that I don't know fully. Because of my limitation in understanding the Arabic language, I wasn't necessarily able to understand exactly what was being said, but I did see something, which I'm sure I can dig up for you if you'd like, that actually this in large part came from his understanding of what the Arabic language is, the way that this society speaks without any nouns, which I don't really know enough Arabic to be able to confirm or deny that, but I'm sorry, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, thank you.
David? David,
you need to unmute, yeah?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Iffat, for your speech. I just wanted to add several things. I hope to make my mind as clear as possible. The first one probably related to Juan's question. If you look at the title of the short story you were mentioning, the Plan Ukbar, you can play with the U and make it Tlon Akbar. And this is something which is very important in Borges, how he has several quotes related to Islam and to Arabic, but also how he conceals things. Because if you see, for example, there's another short story, I don't remember its name right now, he quotes at the beginning Al-Baqarah. And if you look at the number and if you go to the Quran, it's not right. It's a false quote. So this is very important, this game, how he sometimes plays to conceal and sometimes how he exposes some things. I would also like to add that it's very important, a book called Jorge Luis Borges, Sources and Illuminations, which has several things important. The first one, it was published by Octagon Press, which was the press or the book, the book print of Idris Shah. And I don't want to go whether he was a true or not a Sufi, but he was in that line. So that makes you think a lot. And on the other hand, in his during his lecture of the Mil y Una Noches on this book called the Seven Nights, Las Siete Noches, he talks explicitly about Robert Graves. And if you know, Robert Graves was he did the prologue to Idris Shah Sufi's book. And on the other one, he made the translation with his brother, Omar Khayyam, about the Rubaiyat. So it's very clear that he was in contact with that, although it seems like he wants to conceal his relationships both to Sufism and to Islam. And two more things. The other one is that it's very important to keep in mind this figure, Rafael Cancinos Asens. He's from Spain, and Borges says he was his teacher, he's like his master. I wouldn't say in a spiritual sense, but in a more free way. But Rafael Cancinos has something very interesting. He was translating at the same time both the 1001 Nights, both the Quran, and at the same time Persian poets at the same time, simultaneously doing these three translations. So he was very aware of how this was connected and close together, and he was a very big influence on Borges. So I think that's very, very, very important to keep in mind. And the last thing I want to say is that it's very easy to go into trying to understand the relationship between the content, as you did, which is okay, of Borges' works with Islam or with Sufism. But it's also very important to keep in mind the form, because when you read his short stories, it's very easy to say, okay, they are very difficult, they have a lot of knowledge, but you can also read them in the sense that they are designed for that, just to confuse you, just to make your mind get off and to permit some other profound things to flourish. So you can also say, and just Jane here knows much more than me about this, about Sufi short stories and how they are built, how they are designed in several layers. And you can see in Borges this very big attempt. So I think that's also very interesting, not only to look at the content, but at the form. And one last thing I just wanted to add, sorry, I'm talking like very, very quickly. I need to go in a couple of seconds, so I'll just go. But this last thing, I just forgot a little bit about it. Well, never mind. I think this is what was really important. I remember. Is that it's very, I think, this is personal. I think of Borges more than like a Hanifa rather than probably Sufi or Islamic or whatever, because you can also trace easily his roots in Judaism, in Kabbalah, and all that sort of thing. So I think it's very interesting to see it more in that way and easier than in any other one. Oh, sorry, I promise this is the last one. He has a poem called he in English, but if you know, and if you change it in Arabic for who, it's very interesting how he's playing with the idea of the who, both as the pronoun and as the word used in the dhikr. So I think that the poem deserves to be kept in mind and read in a Sufi and mystical sense. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much, David, for your comments. That was lovely, and thank you, Iffat, for this beautiful presentation. It was really inspiring to hear what your project is, is about and how it is developing. I'm really attracted to your question about what is a poet. I have just a quick comment in relation to this particular idea in Ibn Arabi, and then I would like to hear more about you from the perspective of Borges or Latin American literature. When you said about the word itself, poet, and you referred to the word sha'ar in Arabic, with Ibn Arabi, we know quite well that most of his works they are transfused with poetry, especially the Futuhat. Almost every single chapter is starting with a poem, and Claude Hadas wrote a beautiful essay about the use of poetry and the symbolism of that in Ibn Arabi's works. And there is also, even recently, and perhaps Mark and Wafa, Bharatwaj and Cecilia will remember this, is when we were reading the Voyage of Adam and the Secrets of Voyaging. When we were reading the Arabic words, we stopped with the word shu'ur, which is in relation to sha'ar. And this comes up right at the beginning of the Voyage of Adam, and the sentences, it goes like this. He says, in English, he says, and indicates to those who understand them signs, because you mentioned the signs as well, that perceive the existence of the thing called the premises of creation, that people of discernment are aware of. And here, the people of discernment is referred to as Ahl al-Shu'ur. It's like the people of, Shu'ur here is so hard to translate it, but it's, anything that's related to that intuition, to the feelings. And in fact, if you use it in just the literal world, if you say sha'ara, you talk about feeling the pain. So things that are related to the heart. So that was the relation of Ibn Arabi. But I wanted to know a bit more of what brought you to that question. What is a poet? And if you can tell us a bit more about this idea that you brought up today.
I think just personally the reason why I think that's a really important question to ask, particularly in Islamic culture, is because there's somehow this erroneous view that poetry or art isn't allowed in Islam by some people. And I think that sometimes comes from the fact that in the Quran it says to not follow the poets. And the analyses or the commentaries that I've read of that and the explanations of that are very vindicating for someone like me who loves poetry or loves reading it at least. And what I read in that in one analysis was that at the time of Islam, kind of like the birth of Islam, a lot of the opponents of the Prophet would call him a poet, i.e. a liar. And I think so when they say do not follow, I think it says that the poets and the philosophers, what they mean is do not follow the liars, people who invent stories, not people who just write poems. And I think that's why I really wanted to look at this question, because most Islamic thinkers like Ibn Arabi or Ibn Rushd even, or others, they have delved into poetry as a way to explore the nature of God and the nature of man. And Arab poetry is just so rich in its tradition, in a way that even today, for example, thinking about kind of conflicts in the Middle East now, on the BBC you would never ever have them turn on and be like, okay, and now we have Simon Armitage to talk about XYZ. But in the Middle East or in the Islamic world, often they do have kind of poets to talk about political issues as well, or worldly issues, and that's because there is something very perceptive about the poetic tradition in these cultures, and wanting to look at that, and then why that's taken so seriously. Not just this person has great crafted words, but actually see something very important in the world that is worth listening to, even on news and talk shows. I just think it's worth looking at why people then think there's some sort of conflict between Islam and poetry, even though it's so rich in the Islamic world. And then Yeah, the reason I'm looking at Borges partly because I think Borges is great, but partly serendipitously that I decided to learn Spanish at school. So I think just that kind of it just kind of came together. Then I thought, well, Borges is exploring literary traditions from all over the world. As I say, he's looking at Chinese philosophy, Enlightenment philosophy, Norse mythology. So he's engaging in loads of different definitions and expectations of poetry and what the poet is. So that's I guess why I wanted to look at that.
Thank you, Iffat.
Could you also say something about the influence of Ibn Rushd on Borges as a? I mean, I have some interest in him, and I wanted to know what exactly Borges takes from him.
Yeah, so I don't know if you've come across the short story "The Search for Averroes." I would have loved to have kind of talked about that as well. I mean, I did in the dissertation, but for time restraints, I had to cut some things out for today. And in that, I think his depiction of Ibn Rushd is somewhat sympathetic and somewhat almost scathing. He depicts Ibn Rushd or Averroes as a failure, but not in a he doesn't know what he's on about kind of way, but in a so it's a story of Ibn Rushd. He's writing his Tahafut al-Tahafut, right? The incoherencies of the incoherencies, his magnum opus. But the irony is that he leaves that and he's kind of stuck in this writer's block because he's unable to translate the concepts of tragedy and comedy from Aristotle's Poetics. And we know he wrote the commentaries for that. And then he ends up having conversations with other thinkers at the time, and he's unable to understand the concept, these two concepts, tragedy and poetry, because theatre doesn't exist in his lived experience. At least he doesn't think it does. Ironically, missing the fact that there's children outside his window playing Imam and Muezzin and all that sort of stuff, and he just doesn't see that as theatre. But I think, at least my reading of it, and I don't know if many people would agree with me on this, was that Borges kind of uses Averroes or Ibn Rushd to critique the insistent reliance on rationality, because eventually Averroes becomes irrational. He's not seeing what's around him, and he's not seeing it for what it is, and he's not able to think metaphorically. So he and his contemporaries are having a discussion of this so-called rose somewhere in Hindustan, which declares the kalma, so there is none worthy of worship except God, Muhammad is his messenger. And they're all saying there's no way a rose can do that. Not understanding the fact that the rose is a creation of God and therefore bears witness to his existence. Which I don't know then if that's Borges' correct understanding of Averroes, because in my understanding of Averroes really did kind of do that whole, like, look at the world around us, this is all proof of God's existence. But very interestingly, in the postscript, I'm sorry, I've literally got the story right here. He kind of says that I wanted to write a story about a failure, and the best failure that he could think of was Averroes, which is kind of a backhanded compliment. And he said that, sorry, I'm trying to like translate as I go. So he says that I felt that Averroes wanting to imagine what drama is without ever having witnessed theatre was no more absurd than me trying to imagine Averroes, whom I could not access except through Renan and Delane and Asin Palacios. And that, so essentially he likens himself to Averroes, saying that I'm unable to access Averroes the same way Averroes is unable to access Aristotle. Mm-hmm. So I think that's his most explicit reference to.
But there could be a paradox, like how David was saying. There could be a hidden paradox there in that Averroes is also someone who goes back to looking at the real world rather than just being logical, syllogistic. So in that sense, but I think Jane has has been wanting to ask the question. So yeah, so thank you for that. Yes, that's helpful. Jane? No, it did. No, it did. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted, I was very intrigued. I very much like what you say about Borges, about each word leading to an infinite context, which I think Ibn Arabi would very much agree with. But I was very interested in what he said about brevity. Brevity is not what you could attribute to Ibn Arabi, who probably wrote more than anybody could possibly conceive of anybody writing in terms of his actual, even his extant works like the Futuhat. And actually neither Attar nor Homer, you would not attribute brevity to either of them. And so I was intrigued by this thing about whether we might be looking at something which is to do with something which is an expression in contemporary times, which is very different from other times in terms of this thing of brevity.
Yeah, I think that irony is definitely there. Kind of the people that he's talking about or writing about, they know a lot of words, but brevity is not one of them. And I think, yeah, and it's also, yeah, in El Aleph, the story that I very briefly mentioned about that rival, Carlos Argentino Daneri, that's heavily steeped in references to Dante's Divine Comedy, which of course is also not a brief.
Not very brief.
That's not the word you can use to describe it. And I think whilst I think there might be something to be said about that, like that style of writing isn't what's needed anymore, or not necessarily not needed anymore, but isn't what's applicable anymore, because understanding the evolving way that we've understood language, kind of perhaps in a structuralist, post-structuralist way, it doesn't require that that need to rely on length, but it's more kind of about what is said in a short amount of time. And I think, again, kind of coming back to 1001 Nights, you've got a collection of more digestible stories that allow that, and he sees that being done at the same time when other much longer pieces were being written, like these national totalizing literatures. So I think that's why he kind of turns towards that a bit more. I don't know.
Cecilia, did you have a question?
Sorry, I think you're on mute. I think you've muted yourself.
Right. When I put my hand up before, it was with reference to what Iffat had been saying about this question of what is poetry, and why there is some conception amongst some Muslims that poetry is not a good thing. And I think that's, as you sort of mentioned, it's only those false poets who are said you shouldn't follow them. But even Arabi explains that the reason why the Prophet, why poetry wasn't appropriate for him, was because he had to write a clear book, which is clear to everyone. And poetry is to do with symbol and illusion and intuition, sure. And he talks about this like a lot, that it's nothing to do with it being inappropriate. And the luminous verses of the Quran, he says, are revealed as indications of something which would never otherwise be understood. And it has to be at every level, so that even at the most, so that everyone can understand it at some level. Whereas poetry reaches towards meanings which aren't so obvious and which are very ambiguous, not clear, because they're ambiguous. And he also mentions the difference between intuition and knowledge in a poem that he writes, where he says that intuition is what something you have a feeling, an intuition that something is behind the door, but the door is locked. And when the door is opened, then you have certain knowledge because you can see it, because it's revealed. But he also says that this door is you. So reach beyond the poetry to the meanings.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really beautiful. I don't know if I can't top that.
Miha?
I'm just wondering, Iffat, would you say for Borges, is there, would it be right to say that his spiritual strategy in some way of kind of coming about is a kind of denigration of literature in some strange way, like a kind of moving away from allegory, like, is it him using literature to say, like in particular with Aleph, I love that line that he almost kind of gives up halfway, here's my problem, I'm trying to say something that cannot be said. So is he consciously, like, in a way purposefully cutting off the branch that he sits on to see where he will fall? Is that like an element in his writing?
I think so, but ironically. So kind of like, as David was saying earlier, that kind of how he purposefully might misquote something, or he might purposefully make ironic comments, kind of. So as I was saying earlier with in El Asador, how he says, oh, now he can't see the beauty of the universe. Well, he couldn't anyway. Like if you're just thinking physically, he couldn't. So I think that he understands literature's maybe inability, but the fact that it is still the most able compared to everything else, perhaps. And I think coming back to his disdain for the allegory, so just as one example of a form of literature, in the lecture where he says that, so it's on, I can't remember the name of the lecture, it's like on novels and aesthetic, maybe. Correct me if I'm wrong, somebody if you know. On aesthetics and novels, something like that. And he opens it and he says, I would have said that the allegory is the greatest error of the greatest aesthetic error. Then in brackets, he says, but for me, having said that, that would be an allegory. So he knows that he is inevitably sitting on, as you say, a branch that he must have to cut off. And I think that is the paradox of literature, which he's constantly playing with. He's constantly playing with paradoxes, with labyrinths, with mirrors, like all of these motifs and metaphors and images. They can all be applied to his generic understanding of what literature is. But he does so, I think, partly ironically, partly humorously, because he is very funny at times. He isn't, he's talking about really intellectual and profound ideas, but he does it whilst making fun of them. I mean, one of his collections on the universal history of infamy, I mean, he's just knocking out Hegel completely there with Hegel's universal history. He's making fun of the entire Enlightenment in a lot of places in that. And I think, but equally he knows this is the only way he can do it. And I guess using that form to do it is almost, I don't know if it's going to make any sense, but kind of emerging victorious with that form. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, he's fighting fire with fire, but his fire is hotter and brighter. I don't know if that makes any sense. It did in my head.
I think if there are no further questions, Cecilia.
Thank you so much, Iffat, for your wonderful talk. Really, really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I just wondered, because you speak Spanish, yes?
Un poquito.
Only a poquito, because a couple of weeks ago I missed it, but it's on the Mias Latina YouTube channel. Veronica Garcia Moreno gave a talk on, what's the title? Don Cancino's Ascens, which who David mentioned, and Borges. It's called Las Fronteras Líquidas de Al-Andalus. So if you're interested, you can look at the Mias Latina YouTube channel, and that might be of interest to you.
No, I definitely will. Thank you. I've made a note of that. That's fantastic. Thanks.
Thank you, Iffat, for that wonderful presentation and the wonderful discussion. Thank you, everybody, for the participation and the discussion.
Thank you, everyone, for listening and bearing with me. And I apologize for any shortcomings or anything that was incorrect.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you. No, thank you indeed, Iffat. And then that's why we are here. It's just we wanted to be in a friendly environment, and we discuss things that are relevant to your passion and what you enjoy. So really appreciate that you prepared this presentation for us this evening. And we hope that we will have more of this once your project develops even further, maybe in the next couple of months.
So that we come to the end of our session, everyone.
Perhaps one final question with Muhammad.
Yes.
Yeah, one final question with Muhammad, and then we wrap up. Thank you, Bharatwaj, as well. Muhammad, yes, please, we take your last question.
Yes, I have 2 questions, and I would also like to add something in the topic of poets to whom Quran is referring. So can I?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay, yes. Cecilia explained very much. I'm very impressed with her explanation. Something I would like to add is the poets to whom Quran is referring or seem to be criticizing are those who, some poets do wander for sure nowhere or discuss unnecessary things or some sort of overthink. Meanwhile, poetry in many terms isn't an effective way to communicate or to teach, as the metaphors and different tools are used. So to make the stuff of the Quran clear and more clear, poetry isn't used. But if you see in a deeper manner, Quran had a style of a poetry. It's a very fussy and baligh kalam. Okay, and the other thing I would like to suggest, if someone want to read the commentaries on the Quran, as I know the English translations of some effective tafsir, these are Tafsir Ibn Kathir by Muhyiddin Ibn Kathir. These are, I think, 10 volumes, and the Ma'riful Quran, 7 volumes. Okay. And my question is, maybe my question seemed to you some silly, but make me clear about, have Borges ever used the words like Islam, Sufism, Prophet, etc. in his text or in his stuff? So can you tell? As I don't know.
No. That's. I mean, I didn't until a couple of months ago either. But yeah, no, he definitely does. For example, in the story El Zahir, which is of course also a very Islamic term in terms of how to interpret the Quran, he references the Sufis. That's a story about a man also named Borges who acquires a coin, which he becomes very, very obsessed with, to the point where he has to get rid of it. And he concludes that this coin basically contains the universe, and that this coin, not this coin, but this concept El Zahir, this manifests throughout history in loads of different ways. And in that, he, right at the end, he talks about how this can be likened to how the Sufis would repeat the 99 attributes of God until they would lose all meaning, until he could transcend the limits of language. So that's kind of what El-Zahir is for him, that kind of idea of becoming so obsessed with something, repeating it, having it, churn in your mind over and over again, to the point where it loses the material meaning, or our meaning of it, what it means in this world, but through it we are able to access a meaning in the higher world. So that's kind of one place where he talks explicitly about Sufism. In another story, just trying to find the name of it. Sorry, I've got it right here. Ibn Khakan al-Bukhari muerto en su laberinto. So Ibn Khakan al-Bukhari dead in his labyrinth. That opens with actually an inscription. I don't know if you can see it there. With a quote from the Holy Quran, from chapter 29 verse 40, from Al-Ankabut, the spider. And yeah, so he is often talking about Islam and the Sufis explicitly. Then of course we've got stories like The Search for Averroes, in which there's a lot of Islamic culture very, very obvious in there. I guess, yeah, as I said kind of at the beginning of my presentation, I wanted to look at some things which were a bit less obvious, to kind of prove that, or at least suggest that for Borges, he doesn't separate these categories. It's not, this is only about Chinese philosophy and this is only about Norse mythology. They're kind of always interlinked and woven, and he can talk about at any given moment.
Okay, yes, I would like also to thank you personally, as multiple things are discussed excellently, like the topic or the definition of the poet you have discussed, and the infiniteness of words, etc. Just mind-blowing, amazing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, it was mind-blowing. Yeah.
Really kind of you to say.
All right, so thank you again to Iffat for that wonderful presentation, and to everyone for the participation and the discussion, and Iffat also for the response and the helping us understand Borges better and Borges' relationship to the Arabic and Islamic culture better. Thank you very much. So we stop for the day. Till next time.